Eric's one of the smarter dudes I know, and hope you'll enjoy listening to because I love listening to him. So with no further ado, Eric Hyland.
Oh, thanks. This is one of those things that I'll talk in a dark room to nobody about for way too long. So appreciate the fact that you guys are here, and I'm gonna jump around a little bit, not in a way that is like conceptually all over the place, but just as far as specificity is concerned. If at any point you want to get more specific, or if at any point you're like, what the heck are you talking about? You got to back up 5 steps, jump in. This is for a Bixie credit. Congratulations, you all get a credit whether you want it or not. But the more important part of this is less that and more that we have a conversation that leaves you with the opportunity to go out and say something functional about what I'm talking about. So I am much more interested in this being a conversation than I am checking a box that all the slides got looked at and talked about. So I don't know what we have for time. Please go out and get more beer if you need it in the middle of this whole thing. And I will not be offended if you get up and leave before it's done because you have better things to do than be here for all day. But also, we're going to jump in and jump around. So with that said, Corey and Kristen both did an amazing job of what's happening, what's happened, and what's going on. Part of where we sit in this industry, not only because of the name on my shirt and the association we have with Datastrait, but like as you guys are in this room, you are responsible for what is installed, but also for planning and being part of what is going to be installed. And that is where history is important, because we need to be able to learn from where we've been to understand where we're going. And that's a philosophy on the life side of things, that's a human nature thing and everything else. But very quickly, just to build on what these guys said earlier, fiber has been around since, I don't know, let's say the 80s, just to make sure that we cover all of our bases. Fiber has been important since the early 90s. If we went back to those guys that Corey was talking about in the beginning, that were doing stuff with OM1 and everything else, and went and found a really bright bunch of people that were brave and said, hey, what's the fastest the network's ever going to run? What's the highest bandwidth that's going to happen? The really, really brave engineer, after you threatened his family, would say 10 gig. Right? In the early 90s, the fastest anything was ever going to go was 10 gig. Nobody in this room is not, you're all having casual conversations about 40 and 100 gig, and we're starting to think seriously about what 800 gig and 1.2 terabyte looks like. That's just where we are right now. We are infrastructure. Infrastructure does not usually have innovation attached to it. We are there. Successful infrastructure is forgotten about as soon as it's plugged in. It's only measured as a problem if something goes wrong. But what we're seeing is innovation has been far behind what is being asked of us, right? Like, we're here to plug in the edges. We are here to plug in what's asking for. Everybody wants faster cat videos, and they need them sooner, right? This is happening at every stage of what we do. And so bandwidth is constantly increasing. What is being asked for on those edge devices is constantly changing. And the fiber optic cassette was invented in 1993. It's amazing. It's a beautiful thing. But it's 30 years old. And we've been through iterations. You know, there's a lot of old, I'm not going to pick on Corey, but he's been in the business longer than Johnny's been alive, right? So this is one of those things that, like, we've been through changes before. We've seen connector changes as an industry, and the ones that have succeeded, you know, you talked earlier about LCs versus RTGs and everything else, right? And like, yeah, thank you for giggling. So like, those things have happened, and some of them have happened because they were cool, and some of them happened because they were necessary. And the ones that we still talk about are the ones that were necessary. Right, so like, history lesson continued just for a little second, right? We've got MPOs invented in 93, LCs kind of readily accepted and used in the early 2000s. The cassette, as it was designed, has had some small innovations, but for all intents and purposes, has been around since 1993 when the MPO was invented. And that all kind of bundles into the earlier conversations around loss and loss budget. And we're now getting to a point where bandwidth is starting to be pushed in a way that your loss budget, your connectivity budget is the most important budget in your design process. Like, that's a funny place to be, because it used to be, I don't know, we plug this stuff in and it works, and leave me alone, it's gonna be fine. So like, Kristen and Corey did a very good job of talking about like, application matters. Application is starting to matter a lot. Application is the whole reason that we make the decisions that we make. And that theme of it depends, while frustrating to have as an answer, is starting to be the beginning of all your guys' conversations, no matter where you are in this process, from design to installation to troubleshooting on the far side, right? Like, it's now all tied together in a way that's interesting and fascinating, but also frustrating for our one end user that's in the room today, right? So what this is gonna be, and what this is kind of talking about, is like what that implication of higher bandwidth need is driving our industry, which is almost never innovative, to be innovative in a space where it hasn't happened in the last 30 years. So, we are here to service the end equipment. We're here to service the end product, but it's not just about that, right? Like, the path to get there is still important. The path to get there is still part of what we're talking about. So, optical fiber connectivity will impact all this stuff, right? Your channel budget, your loss budget, all those things, as Corey touched on earlier, is all based on stuff getting plugged in. Those TIA specifications of .75 insertion loss for every single LC ferrule is based on the worst case scenario that TIA is willing to certify to. It's not what we're actually seeing out there as far as when we measure stuff, but it's the automatic calculation that kind of lumps into what's acceptable. And that's an interesting concept, right? Because Kristen just pointed out that, like, we are now being limited by what we've qualified as acceptable, not what is possible. And so we're starting to push those edges also. And we're starting to ask, like, how and why and where and when and all those kind of fun things. But so density and scale is what's driving this. Again, the question of what can I have for bandwidth, what is available, is where this is kind of coming from and where it's going at. And just to throw a lot of numbers at you, so you don't think I'm making this stuff up, right? Like, that dB is a logarithmic scale. And the very fast version of how that works is, as things get faster, the amount of loss is half as much. So as we're doubling what our bandwidth is, the amount of acceptable loss is half of what it was before. So as we're getting into this space of 400 gig, 800 gig, 1.6 terabyte, acceptable losses are going to come down dramatically. So right now, single mode loss in a 100 gig channel is 1.9. You have these things memorized. Yeah, all right. We're going to pretend he shook his head, yes. 1.9, 1.2, somewhere in that range of things. As we go to 400 gig, then now we're in that, like, 1. As we go to 800 gig, we're going to be in that .75 range. As we get to 1.2 terabyte, they haven't really certified that anywhere, but let's just say that based on the math, we're looking at somewhere around .5 dB for acceptable loss. Now, your traditional transceiver, patch cord, cassette, trunk, cassette, patch cord, transceiver, that link all day long, 1 to 1.2, depending on whose stuff you got, and how clean everything is. Cleanliness is important. Always clean your fiber. Serious PSA right here. Clean your stuff. So like all of that piles back into, we need to start paying attention to how we're plugging stuff in. We need to start paying attention to what our connectors are. And what was working, while it works now, is probably not going to work in the future. And we're seeing this happen. We've seen this happen before. This is not a new philosophy. This is not new doom and danger, right? This is just the continuous evolution of what we're going to continue to see in our industry. It's just our industry has the advantage of not being as necessarily quick as everyone else, right? Like we are able to be slower in our transitions because we haven't found the upper echelon of what single mode could do, right? Like we're in these fun places where like we're now more likely to be limited by heat dissipation of a transceiver than we are glass being able to hold light in it or not, right? Your earlier question around like cleanliness of signal versus cleanliness of glass and everything else, yes, cleanliness of signal matters, but only because computers are kind of dumb. All they're doing is reading a blinking light real fast. So as long as that light has enough space for the new blink to be there, it's always going to understand what it's hearing and what it's reading. So if we make it cleaner and brighter, brighter's a little bit dangerous, right? Like, I like to think about fiber optic cables for like how my brain works as like garden hoses, right? And like light moving through them is a lot like water. So like we've been living in a world where, and you guys know like you screw two garden hoses together and there's always a little bit of a leak, right? Like that happens with fiber optic cable. Every time you make two connections, there's always a little bit of leak. That's what loss is, right? That's what Corey was talking about earlier. That's where our channel budgets are. All that stuff is based on light wants to be everywhere all the time, and we're trying to hold it in this tight little tube that's smaller than the size of a hair, right? So when you got a garden hose, there's always a little bit of leak. When you connect two together, it's not really a big deal. Water gets a little bonus, grass gets a little bit of bonus watering in one spot. You move that around every once in a while. Usually you put it over where the dog patches are, right, and life goes on. So what we're doing effectively with our increased demands is we're asking to take that garden hose and put it at the fire hydrant down the street. So now that little bit of a leak in the backyard is a koi pond, right? And like to kind of beat on this analogy a little bit, each droplet of water is a packet. Each droplet of water is a part of that puzzle that's trying to be that information going to the other end. And computers are really good at making guesses. We can give them 45% of a picture and they'll figure out what the rest of that picture is. And that's kind of how information moves through a network, right? Is that we're chopping it up, we're putting it into envelopes, and we're sending those envelopes over to the other side. They're all being received, opened up, and then the puzzles are getting reassembled again. Computers are really good at doing that, and they're really good at putting those puzzles back together, and they're really good at making guesses about the puzzle pieces that they haven't received yet, so we can get those cat videos faster. But they still need a certain amount of what that picture is before it can actually know what it is. So as an American, it always feels like more is better. If I'm having a problem, I just turn up the volume, right? Like I just take that 40 gig transceiver out, put a 100 gig transceiver in, we're off to the races. That's creating more problems if all we're doing is changing our transceiver and not thinking about what our infrastructure is. Connectivity is starting to be important. And so just by turning up that volume, we're just turning up the pressure on that water system. That's just a bigger leak that's happening somewhere. That's more information not making it to its final destination. And so connectors are an important part of how this is going to continue to fall. And that's why we see these evolutions happening, right? Like this is all driven by what's happening on the edges. I pretty much talked about this already. So why 400 gig was driving this, was driving that innovation more than just more is better, is that we're being more sophisticated with the information. We're creating an environment where more information can be consumed, so naturally you want to consume it, right? And like in the world of buzzwords, that's AI, that's all those fun things that you say yes to without thinking about it whenever you go to a shopping website or anything else. Like all of that information is constantly being consumed about us. And what we want is being sliced into thinner and thinner slices to understand who we want to talk to and why we want to talk to them, right? So this is coming from the big side of things. But you guys live in the world where, hey, I heard that Google's doing this thing, tell me about it. That's a real conversation that I know the Datastrait guys are having every day, right? Hey, Facebook is putting in a new data center, they're doing these things. Why? How can I leverage that new thing, how's that gonna help me? So like, all the cool kids are doing it. Social peer pressure exists just as much in fiber optic infrastructure, just not at the same rate as it does in fashion or anything else, right? So we're seeing these things happen, and some of it's being driven by problems that are being created. Let's pick on the medical field just for an example, right? I'm not gonna say that medical industry innovation is lazy, but they need to sell new equipment every 5 years, and the best way to do that is to put a faster NIC card in their old CAT scan machine. Create higher resolution images so that you can have them. Those things are consuming massive amounts of bandwidth to the point where your cloud-based infrastructure is swinging hard back to having on-prem and being much more hybrid than it was 3 to 5 years ago, right? Like, and that's happening everywhere for various different reasons that all boil down to, I want my stuff faster and I don't want to wait for the internet to give it to me. So we're gonna build a more robust network on-prem with bigger storage facilities on-prem so that I can have that stuff faster and sooner. Now, where is this going and why do we care? We're still in this part where most everything that you guys are gonna be doing is 40 and 100 gig. Most everything that you guys are talking about is probably just starting to be 400 gig. What we built stuff on has been there for 30 years. If you're only ever gonna do 100 gig, stay with what you know, right? Like, it's really a bad way to start this conversation about here's new and exciting things to say, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But like, if you know that you're never gonna hit more than 100 gig and everything's working the way it is, awesome, keep up the good work. But if you currently have stuff that's 10 gig and you know eventually you're gonna end up at 100 gig, let's talk about what that looks like. Let's talk about what the infrastructure is, because you're going to be challenged at some point to make the smallest change possible to have the biggest impact long term. And that all kind of falls in that overused marketing disgusting word called future proofing. But in reality, it's just planning productively now so that you don't have to deal with a headache later, right? So, lost budgets, Corey already talked about a lot, but let's just hit this hammer. Let's swing this hammer one more time and see if we can hit a couple new nails. So like, we know 400 gig is 3 dB. We know 100 gig is 6.3 dB as far as acceptable loss is concerned. Now these are limits given to us by regulatory bodies. But as both Corey and Kristen's presentations have touched on, that is based on one half of the conversation, right? Like, we're talking about this side of things as far as what acceptable losses are from a what you're going to test to standpoint, to getting that green checkbox on your test equipment, not for what the laser's pushing, not for the cleanliness of the signal that you're looking for, not for what your actual data rates are and what your bandwidth concerns are going to be. So like, yes, this, but also at the end of this, I'm going to talk a lot about optical headroom. Hopefully you guys are still awake and maybe have another beer in your hand because it gets a little weird, but we'll get there eventually. But optical headroom is something Tori also touched on earlier that is important for this, right? And so like, that's the other half of that conversation. That's the other half of that why do I care kind of thing. And here's where we get into design, right? Here's where we get into sitting down on a desk with a diagram, with a wiring diagram, and you start making your red circles, right? You're making circles at every connection point. You're making circles at every time polarity is going to change. You're making circles at every time that you know that there could be a problem and we have to pay attention to what this thing is. If we just look at the red circles on this for a second, we're just looking at connected pairs. And again, each connected pair is a place where loss will happen, right? Like, light wants to be everywhere. So in the case of a cassette, we've got an MPO connector in the back. We got LC connectors coming out the front. Pretty basic, pretty standard. 2 points of loss. When we look at this from a whole budgeting standpoint, you know, Corey didn't really talk about this that much because like in the majority of what we do more often than not, especially in the data center space, the distances are not very long. How many of you guys are in data centers versus, we'll do this in a binary sense. Show of hands, who's outside plant stuff? All right, show of hands, who's inside? All right, so the inside guys don't care about this as much as the outside guys do, right? But that 3.5 dB per kilometer in a cable matters from a loss perspective. Like, we don't ever think about light as having friction, right? Light goes so fast. We always talk about the speed of light, faster than light, you know, Star Trek, everything else. But the reality is that light has friction. And so light over long distances actually has loss because light has friction. Even though you're scraping a gloss glass, you're still slowing down eventually. So for the longer stuff, that 3.5 dB per kilometer of cable actually matters when we're calculating loss budget. Inside, if you're doing a run that's over 400 feet, you'll start seeing interesting numbers that you actually have to take into account. Anything under 400 feet, a little less so. It's still there. It's still there, but light still goes pretty fast, so it doesn't matter as much. Most all of these numbers are based on 2 mated connector pair or 3 mated connector pair and 100 meter cable. So like, that's where the standards are, right? That magic number of 100 meters, everything over 100 meters isn't, even on the copper side of things, a category, right? Like, that's 100 meters is this weird magic number, but life exists outside of that. So just grain of salt, what these mean and where they're coming from. That's kind of the math that's used for all of this, just so that we have a baseline that no one's going to remember as we throw these numbers around. OM4, as Corey talked about earlier, the modality, again, you guys want to have a modality conversation? Is that something you're interested in? That amount of sleepiness in your eyes says no. So real fast and real easy. Single mode and multi-mode. Multi-mode, 2 wavelengths, shorter distances, smaller bandwidths. Used to be that everyone put multi-mode in because it was so much cheaper. You weren't going very far. Again, only a couple of hands for long distance stuff. And all of the bandwidths we were talking about, the brave people were thinking 10 gig was as fast as we're going to go. So like 40 gig is 4 channels of 10. We also, based on glassy eyes and half full beers, are not going to talk about multi-wave multiplexing. But multi-mode, shorter distances, smaller bandwidths. Single mode, unknown distances, unknown bandwidths. Single mode used to be really expensive. Then Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Apple started buying single mode transceivers like they were lollipops. So now, single mode transceivers and multi-mode transceivers are almost the exact same price. For the sake of this argument and where the world is going, 100 gig transceivers are all going to be single mode and no one's going to blink. If you're talking about building brand new infrastructure, don't talk about multi-mode unless your customer is insistent upon it. There's no advantage to multi-mode anymore. This is a lot of bias. This statement is very biased and not at all attached to the Bixby credit that you're not aware that you're getting right now. Multi-mode is really unnecessary in any new infrastructure. If you really want to go in the future-proofing world of things, put in single mode and don't even think about it because of the bandwidth, right? We're still at this weird limit of bandwidth. Corey touched on it briefly around OM5 and DWDM, and like there are some ways to kind of solve for that bandwidth problem, but the reality is that just put in single mode, man. Let's move on to the next thing. And so this is what happens when you do it in 3 mated connector pairs as opposed to 2. And the math is here and the graph is pretty, but this all kind of nets back around to just use single mode, right? And so what we're seeing is in the next evolution, MTPs and MPOs and LCs are turning into, I'm going to steal back my thunder now, very small form factor connectors. And the reason for this is that loss problem that we were talking about earlier, that light sprays everywhere all the time thing, that you increase bandwidth without doing anything else, and you're just going to spray more light everywhere, really boils down to alignment. You guys probably can't see this because this is a, bad fuzzed out picture, but all MTPs are either 12 fibers or 24 fibers across, right? Your alignment is those two pinholes right there. Lining up 12 of anything is hard. Corey helped me establish earlier that a fiber is smaller than the human hair. So lining up 12 of those is, why are you even trying? When we're talking about doing a bad job, lining these up, and what that means for data rates and bandwidth and loss, this is a very lossy connector, right? That LC connector, which I'm not tall enough to point at, I'm gonna just steal this one over here, and the MDC ferrule are both terminated with a LC ferrule, right? From a loss and throughput perspective, if you're gonna terminate a piece of fiber, terminating it with a little white ceramic tip of the LC connector is the cleanest, best way to do that. So this is the best way to terminate a fiber. Controversially, this might be the worst way to terminate a fiber. Now all of a sudden, alignment matters. Let's stop doing this one, right? That's kind of the idea here. So if we move towards this, we have a single housing, fixed distances, duplex connection. And that's really important, right? Like LC connectors even today, I opened up with a little bit of history lesson. Let's just talk about this for a second. Like change is scary, right? Like we're about to talk about some interesting changes. Change is terrifying. We are alive today because one of our ancestors says that rock was fuzzy today, it wasn't fuzzy yesterday, I'm gonna run in the other direction, right? Like, we are the survivors, we're the ones that didn't get eaten. So we are here because change is scary. That's human nature. Getting people excited about things that are change is really hard to do. Change for change's sake, the MTRJ, that was cool, but it had no real function to it. There was no real reason other than, hey, this is a cool thing we can do, why it was important, and it failed. This very small form factor concept is born from necessity. So it's a lot more interesting from that standpoint, right? The reason that an LC plug looks and feels the way it does today is because an RJ485 connector looked and felt like it did. And because change is scary, and we were used to what copper connectors felt like, we built a fiber optic connector to, don't worry, it feels just like the copper one. You know, it's not gonna be hard to think about, right? Like, that works real well, but we're now 20, 30 years later, we're comfortable with how fiber works, so we can start looking at what we can do to change our form factor to then be more functional with the space we have or the space we wanna be in. Same way, like ridiculously, this is 12 fibers. The QSFP, which is most of the time what these plug into, are 4 transmit and receive pair. So we're only ever using 8 of these 12 fibers. And of the ones we're using, we're leaving dead the middle ones, which are, back to that alignment problem, probably the closest to being aligned perfectly. So we're ignoring and leaving empty the thing that lines up the best. And the only reason we do that is because we evolved from copper. When you terminated a piece of copper, I mean, Corey can tell you, there's a few other hands that got raised. Like when you terminate a piece of fiber or copper, you stick it up, you fold down the edges, punch them down, and then cut out the middle part. So when we were lining up and thinking about how we were gonna do fiber, we ignored the middle part because that's what we did with copper. So like that change was scary, so we did the same way we did before. We create all kinds of fun new problems for ourselves as we're getting closer and closer to this thing being at the edge of what we can do with how things were designed to begin with. So good news, we all know what fiber optics are now. It's no longer scary. We can start doing some things to kind of change how and what this looks like. And as I said, this is all born from the transceiver, right? So like, I'm gonna do this quickly because it's assigned to me and probably only me, and I'm the one talking. So I'm gonna talk about it a little bit, but in the world of stories and things, one of your favorite hyperscale customers said, hey, transceiver manufacturers, make us a transceiver that we can channelize QSFP at the transceiver itself. As I just said, QSFP is QSFP, SFP, so quad SFP, so you've got 4 transmit receive pair in a QSFP. Transceiver manufacturers said, sure, we can do that, but LC is giant. MPOs are stupid. We need a new connector, right? So they said, here's what this is going to look like. Here's what the layout's going to be. Here's where the lasers are going to be located. Dear connector manufacturers, good luck. And so Senko and US Connect said, we like to do stuff that's different. We've done this before. We'll still be able to sell LC ferrules. Perfect. So they went out and said, all right, so what they did was they said, these are set up here, these are set up here. Change is scary. So for a very short amount of time, Senko made the CS connector, Charlie Sierra. This was kind of like the middle spot. This was just a shrunken version of an LC. Proof of concept, single housing, 2 fixed point LC ferrules. These things are still floating. These things are still independent. This is still something I can miss when I plug this back in, right? Like, this solved that problem. This is still way too big. This is still weird and bulky and strange and just feels like a shrunken version of this. So then they moved to the SN, vertical, 2 ferrules, fixed position. US Connect did the same thing with the MDC. These now stack or align 4 in a row in a QSFP. So they took where the lasers were, where the transmit, where the receive is, and said, here's our fixed distance, here's how we're gonna plug into it, answered your question, transceiver manufacturers, let's go conquer the world. So this whole idea of the very small form factor is born from and dictated and driven by what transceivers are starting to push into the industry. So this is an answer to a question and an innovation. Now, in the world of where this gets fun and exciting for us, this means that we can start playing around with architecture. This means we can start playing around with how switches are deployed. This means that we can start playing around with how our network architecture actually sits, and also where and how decisions are made as far as where TR rooms are, and what that means for what we can do from a distance perspective. What that means for you guys is you have a new fun thing to talk about that's on the cutting edge, that's on the bleeding edge, that's about to happen, that brings your value add back to full send, right? What that also means is you've got another thing to think about as far as, is this a use case for this new thing I just heard about that Eric's excited about, that I was mostly falling asleep to, so what did he really say? But the important thing here is that with very small form factor connectors, we can fit 3 of these in the same place as 1 LC. So we'll start playing density games. We can now have perfect alignment with our transmit and receives. So we're now mitigating loss to almost 0. And the other thing that we're doing is we can eliminate switches. We can eliminate a whole layer of switches in your architecture by doing channelized breakout at the transceiver, which means that in your very large networks, where your 400 gig cable is plugging into a 100 gig switch that's really just an aggregation point, you can eliminate that. We can do some really fun and interesting things with how direct connectivity can carry your channelized information back through your switch architecture. Or save the end users a boatload of money because they don't have to pay Cisco weird licensing fees for things they never use, right? So that's really the fascinating thing that we're able to do with how and why this kind of jumped into. The other thing that's really cool from an infrastructure standpoint that we're doing is we're starting to be able to play around with what not having cassettes looks like. And being able to eliminate a cassette in your infrastructure eliminates your conversations around polarity, eliminates your conversations around gender, eliminates that massive amount of loss because there's only 1 connection point instead of 3 connection points, right? So like that's where this stuff pushing into 200 gig, 400 gig, 800 gig, 1.2 terabyte starts to eat into those optical losses and everything else. By having this new form factor where we can guarantee positioning of LC ferrules, and the LC ferrule being the cleanest connection point from a loss and throughput perspective, we can now start pushing into direct mating breakout and what that kind of looks like, right? And here's an example of it with MDC to MDC. This is, again, MDC is going to be a big part of, like, Senko and SN, MDC and US Connect. We're going to talk more about MDC only because I have more of those pictures. But anything that says MDC is also SN, right? Just in the back of your head. And here's the difference in size. You know, Corey threw up this slide earlier. As I said, I'm stealing some of my thunder back. So, like, there is a bit of a comparison here. What you're doing with MPOs, what you're doing with duplex LCs, we can now do in the same space with more, right? So that density is increasing. What that's doing is what was a traditional cassette and all of the things that are associated with that are now just a single direct mating breakout. So, you know, if we go back a couple slides here, just because this is a fun picture, these are your new jumper cables, right? This is replacing this. This is being replaced with this. Notice that in this one, single housing, direct LCs fixed positions. Single housing, LCs fixed positions. In the world of things that are exciting for us, as we were coming up with, what is that, are you the laser button? As we were coming up with this guy, we solved for the trunk, right? Infrastructure is very trunk-centric, which is funny to me because we plug into things that don't care at all about trunks and only care about transmit-receive pair, but yet we talk about things in fibers as opposed to ports, which is a transmit-receive pair. But anyway, we built this. We said, hey, we have this pretty good idea, now we have to figure out what a jumper looks like. US Connect came to us and said, hey, we just came up with this new connector. Do you guys have any use for it? And we're like, you just saved 3 years of R&D by having something that was probably way better than what we would have built anyway. So this we were encouraged by because it's a single housing, fixed position, 2 LC ferrules. Single housing, fixed position LC ferrules. Now, anybody who's still paying attention and can count to 8 will notice that this is 4 transmit receive pair, 8 ferrules. That's not on accident, right? I talked earlier about QSFPs being kind of the driving factor behind this, and how it's funny that so many of these are carrying traffic from QSFPs and the middle 4 of them are dead. If we're going to have something new, it can't be harder. If we're going to do something new, it can't make your guys' lives more difficult. It has to be approachable in order for it to be readily accepted everywhere. If we're going to do something new, let's be logical about it. Let's learn from our mistakes. Let's say we don't have to think about copper when we're talking about what fiber is going to look like. A QSFP is 4 transmit receive pair. Let's make our unit of measure for the infrastructure that we're plugging into that same QSFP. Let's be purposeful with the fibers we've got so we're not wasting them in places that they're never going to be used. So we like this idea of a QSFP as our unit of measure. What that does from a trunk perspective is it looks exactly the same. Your fiber counts stay exactly the same as they were before, and everything just kind of breaks out a little bit differently. We're getting rid of cassettes. We're going to direct main breakout. We're getting rid of this connection point and this connection point and replacing it with this connection point. We're getting rid of all this fiber in the middle. Again, fiber does have loss just by light moving through it, right? This has 3 kind of funny benefits that probably affect you guys more than it does the end users we talk about. Ergonomics are important, right? Like, you guys are in charge of movesets and changes. You guys are going out and touching LCs. I have big, dumb American hands, and I have caused more than 9 intermittent loss of signal failures and errors in networks across my lifetime. and I am not proud of it, but it happens, right? You go to unplug something and you accidentally kind of unplug half of the thing next to it, and you don't know that it's did it, and then 6 weeks later, all of a sudden something doesn't work because it finally got shooken just enough that it's not there anymore, and then you have to go back and figure out where that air gap is and what that looks like, and then plug it back in again. And maybe you found the only one, but the secret is there's probably 9 of them that are out there that you still don't know about it. So ergonomics are important, and speed is important, right? Time is money. That doesn't change. There's 168 hours in a week, and that's it. That's what you got. So being able to go out and say, hey, you can do this faster matters. Let's talk about the MDC for a second and the fact that the latching mechanism is now part of the boot. So now you've got all the flexibility of a boot, but that's also your latching mechanism. So if you want to go in and grab something, be brave. Stick your hand in. Again, these are nice pictures. I'm saying a lot of hopefully interesting words. This all exists on a table out here. So when we're done with this whole thing, get a second beer, come out here and unplug stuff. Let's plug stuff in, let's unplug it, let's look at this. If you have questions, great. If you don't, have a great evening all the same, right? But, so these are pictures, but this all lives in reality. This happens all the time. I was just talking about it. Latching mechanism is now back here as part of the boot. So instead of having to fish your hand in real close by, we just tripled our densities, right? There's a panel out here that has 288 fibers in 1 RU, right? Most of you should have been a bigger gasp than that. I can tell how many of you are either listening or don't play with that side of the industry. That's insane. That's double what anybody else has ever thought about doing. So like casually, we can do it, it's no big deal. Usually the second part of the conversation is, how do I get my hands in there? What does that mean? What does that look like? Because the latching mechanism is part of the boot, because this whole thing is flexible, if it's new, it has to be approachable. It can't be harder than what you're doing now. So the fact that these are really close to each other doesn't matter. It's actually pretty cool. The other half of this is, usually the third question is, all right, you got this new fancy thing, polarity still matters, right? For the guys that do installation, you plug everything in, you run a tester, it fails, the first thing you do is flip polarity and try again. Just, that's how we all work. When you flip polarity, usually I lose this piece. It falls on the floor, and it goes underneath the cabinet, and it's lost forever. And I'm sad. Or, if it's a different version, I twist this too many times in the same direction, and it breaks off, and then it's gone forever, because I now need a whole new jumper, because I just broke the fiber in the cable, because it's smaller than a human hair, and it's delicate and precious. With the latching mechanism being on the boot, all you're doing is disconnecting the latching mechanism, rotating it around the boot, and then reattaching it. The really fun part about this is that we have a lot of downtime at trade show booths and everything else. This is a fun new game to play. It's called Who Can Do This the Fastest. We put 6 seconds because we didn't think anyone would believe us if we put 2 seconds, right? To do this one is 48 seconds. And I say that with confidence, not because I'm really fast at this one, but because what we did is we commissioned an ergonomic study. We knew this was going to be better. We knew this was going to be faster. We didn't know how much. We didn't know at what point. So we went out and we said, hey, you who does this for a living, pulling a bunch of guys off the street. Not really, they were contractors. They weren't just like random people walking down the street with clipboards, not that kind of thing. We went down, we commissioned a study, they brought in contractors, they said, do this. Here's how you do it this way, here's how you do it this way, go do this. There's videos, there's stopwatches, all this is available. Talk to Jamie, he's got versions of all this stuff to send you guys if you want it. It's here. And the net of that was 48 seconds. It's the average time it takes to change the polarity of an LC connector. And 4 seconds was the average time it took for the MDC connector. Now, that's all well and good. That's an MDC connector, that's ergonomics, blah, blah, blah. What does this look like when it's actually deployed? What does this look like when it's actually in the thing? How does this go when we actually talk about giant data centers as opposed to just a single thing sitting at a desk somewhere? It has to be easier, it has to be faster, It has to be approachable and it has to be scalable. If this only works for 8 fibers, nobody here is only running 8 fibers anywhere, right? Like, maybe some of you outside guys are, but you're a bunch of weirdos and you're just going big bandwidths between buildings anyway. The really interesting stuff happens once you get inside the building and there becomes lots and lots and lots of fibers. So, what ends up happening is this does scale. This has to, right? When we talk about density, we talk about this as far as a conversion adapter. That's that unit of 8, right? That's that unit of QSFP. We can put 3 of these or 6 of these in a panel. We can put 4 panels in an enclosure. That math, real quick, you can believe me, is 92. Nope, don't believe me because I just did it wrong. It's 96 fibers if we do all 24s and 192 fibers in 1 RU if you do all 48s. And then if you really want to get crazy, as I said, we can do 288 fibers in 1 RU. So this scales. This scales as much as you need to, but it doesn't have to be scary if it needs to stay small. Now I promised you we were going to talk about this, and we've reached that slide. So everybody take a little baby stretch and get your brains and ears ready, because this is exciting stuff for about me and Corey and nobody else. Maybe Jamie on a good day. Kind of trying to get Johnny there. Jack's too new to know any different, so he's going to pretend he's excited. But optical headroom in general is kind of this concept that gets thrown around in the infrastructure world without really acceptance, without really a lot of understanding behind it or purpose behind it, right? Like, probably the best way to think about it is, I am not a small human being. I can fit through a 2-foot hole, which means if there was a 2-foot pipe that went from this side of the room to that side of the room, I get the other side. Nobody would want to talk to me when I got there, though, because I'd be a mess, right? I'd be gross and sweaty and disheveled, and I might not have all my shoes. Like, it'd be a disaster, right? But if I were to just walk across this room, hopefully at least one of you would want to shake my hand, right? So, like, optical headroom is the idea that, like, having more space to operate in actually makes it so that what you're doing is happier on the other end, right? Like, and that goes for data too. So if I have 10 gig of data and I'm putting it through a 10 gig pipe, it will arrive, but the computer will probably ask for it again because not all that stuff that it has to guess on showed up pretty enough to be able to understand what it is. You know, Kristen talked about it earlier with bit error rate, and Corey touched on it earlier with forward error rate correction and testing. That is that concept that, like, we're sending information that we know is going to end up corrupted on the other end. We did a bunch of studies that this kind of picture dictates or shows or captures that if you have more optical headroom, your network performs better. I'm just going to pretend that you guys are amazed by that also. How that goes is, if you put in a connector that has lower loss and do nothing else, your network performance is better. You do nothing else. Change your connector, lower your loss, increase your optical headroom, network performance is markedly better with no other changes. That's kind of a wild thing to say, that I can say a connector will make your network better and be able to do it with a straight face in a room full of people drinking beer. But it's true. If we increase optical headroom, if we lower loss, network performance gets significantly better, which is how and why, if you build a network today, even if you're not going to use it, your network will perform better. If you're putting in a new network, connectivity matters, even if you're not going any further. So even though I open up by saying, if you're doing 100 gig and you're never going to do more, don't change anything, don't. But if you're building new things and you're still not going to do anything more than 100 gig, talk to the guys at Datastrait. Let's put together a plan, because your network will behave better, and in those weird burps where it needs to be more, it can be with nothing else having to change in a way that's actually meaningful. And that kind of boils back down to increasing your optical headroom gives you that room to breathe and that space to expand when necessary. And that's kind of where we're seeing things go and kind of how we're seeing them go there without being sleepy at the end of it. So I did a lot of talking. Thank you all for giggling a little bit in the silly places. Jamie Rue has a question. Thank you. I appreciate you already.
So on a typical link here, let's just say that there's going to be LC to LC. We would presume, according to the TIA, we would see allowable 0.75 dB mated pair, 0.75 dB mated pair. So you've got a loss budget ostensibly 1.5. What are you seeing with MDC to MDC? What kind of loss are you seeing in the same kind of link?
Sure, yeah. So I'm going to answer that question, then I'm going to answer the question you actually asked, because there's a secret question in there that I love that you just threw out there. If we do nothing else and we just do MDC to MDC and leave everything else the same, like, it's still an LC ferrule. So like that LC to LC connection and that LC to LC and the MDC to MDC connection is the same connection either way because it's that same ferrule in both cases. What is funny about that though is that the alignment in the MDC one is way more precise than the alignment in the LC one. So the TIA would come back and say it's the same ferrule, it's the same number. But what we're actually seeing anecdotally out there, especially when we fold in, where's my magic clicker? There it is. We're gonna go back a bunch of slides. If you have epilepsy, close your eyes. When we go back to the idea and the concept of using this guy from our trunk side of things, and then using this guy for our breakout instead of this guy, what we're seeing is we're publishing losses here at 0.4 dB is what we're saying in all of our literature. Again, logarithmic scale means that that kind of movement from 1.2 to 4 is not a third. That movement from 1.2 to 4 is 300, right? So we're seeing a multiplier of 300 in a difference by just changing from this to this, which is where so that optical headroom is 3 times as much, right? To go back to the thing that I was just talking about. And to answer the second half of your question, anecdotally, what we're seeing here from a loss perspective and deployments is 0.03 is the best we're seeing that's any kind of consistency to talk about.
So fusion splice losses.
I just pointed at Corey because that's exactly what I was going to say, right? So like what Corey was talking about earlier with fusion splice losses and firing guys if they saw 0.2, usually you want to give guys a pat on the back when they get to 0.015 to 0.02. Upper level of acceptable is 0.03. With a preterm solution, we're able to replicate fusion splice level versions of loss. That's really fun to be able to stand up here and say too, so I appreciate you asking that question.
So the takeaway would be if you're in a data center, this is certainly a thing, but if you're in a campus, this is really a thing.
Yeah. Especially, so usually the next part of that question is, I'm in a campus, I'm pulling this thing across the ground, I don't know how long the distance is, I don't want you to give me any ends because I'm pulling it through a small hole anyway. We build versions of this that have a pigtail on it so that you splice it in and then you still have all the flexibility and mobility and agility of a preterm solution, and you don't have to worry about sacrificing any of that loss because we're still going to give you, even at the preterm connection point, the same kind of losses that you'd have at that splice in the pigtail. So we're well below our optical budget there also. Yeah. You raise your hand first, so you get to go, Keith.
I was just curious where the manufacturers are at with the MDC. Are you seeing anything coming out of the manufacturers related to, the SFP vendors?
Yeah, great.
Anything in that space?
It's almost like these guys were planted in the room or something. But yes, so the other part of this that is important is, like, I talked about how we're seeing transceiver manufacturers moving towards, and this being born from transceivers having these things. Quick plug for Legrand, we are a transceiver manufacturer. We are making MDC-based transceivers. All of our transceivers come from the same factories in the same line with just different stickers on them as your other favorite transceiver manufacturers. That's a different conversation that Johnny can have with you later. But the important thing here is that, like, these are being built now. You can buy these today. MDC-based transceivers at 100 gig and 400 gig are available on the market, and we're prototyping 800 gig ones right now. So like, this isn't happening in like ghosts of Christmas future kind of way. This is what's happening right now today. You can buy them on your phone without even having to get up from the table. Now, if I cover the name of my shirt and ignore everything and give you a little bit of bias again, Cisco won't talk about this until they unload the 9,000 boats they have floating in the ocean, still waiting to land at port. So like, we're probably a year and a half from people talking about this earnestly, but it's happening now. It's happening, it's available now, it's happening now. And if you ask them, and you ask the right guy, he'll actually talk about how you can buy one from him too. Was that your question? Okay, good. Anybody else?
How is this ratified and adopted through TIA and big shots in the industry?
Yeah, so yes and not yet, right? So all of the things are moving through TIA right now. You might find it hard to believe that an organization based on standards and bureaucracy is being bureaucratic about things. So like, it's slowly making its way through that process. I'd say probably the more interesting part from a standards perspective is that the MDC was born from the MSA or the manufacturer's agreement between all the different transceiver manufacturers. So like, that standard is being driven more from what we're seeing from transceivers than what will get ratified by the TIA as far as what dimensions are going to look like and what loss is going to be and all that kind of stuff. But in the meantime, while it's working its way through the different standards bodies, the MSA is what's kind of driving that design and everything else and standardizing how that's going to look. So it won't ever change. It'll just get a quick emoji thumbs up once either all the paperwork's kind of looked at, or if there's a high enough rate of adoption in the industry. It's just kind of a race between those two as far as what's going to get to the certification level first, or what's going to force that certification to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is there any taste for these becoming anything but single mode?
Oh yeah, no, they're both, right? So like, I like to poo-poo multi-mode because I'm confused by the fact that it's still around. But the reality is that we have sold as much OM5, OM4, and signal mode. It's almost exactly the same for this solution. So yes, everything is yellow because that's what we built first, because that's what, like, this was born, this concept, this idea is born from high bandwidth data center applications. So it's born from single mode. But we're finding, to Jamie's question earlier, more success early with campus environments and multi-mode applications than we are with the single mode applications. I think some of that just has to do with the size of the projects, but also the agility that this offers. Because one of the fun things with loss that we haven't really talked about, because it's a little bit in that gray area, is that we can start pushing distances, right? So like, in a multi-mode environment where you're limited by a distance, if you have to go a couple more rows over without really being able to change anything else, change your connector, lower your loss, increase your optical headroom, you can get that extra 100 feet, 200 feet, right? Like, so like, we're having some really interesting, fun conversations in that space. We're having a lot of success in the multi-mode side of things. So if you ignore my bias and we just look at what's actually happening out there, this is as much a multi-mode solution as is a single mode solution, because it is a loss and headroom solution first. The modality is just kind of a function of what you guys have in your areas. So thanks for asking that, because I do get a little carried away with not really liking multi-mode as much as I guess I should. But any other questions? How'd I do for time?
Great.
Oh man.
We did start at 4 o'clock, so it's
All right.
you're good.
All right.
Good job.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody.